You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've got a bombshell development here as Donald Trump yet again engages in the weaponization of government with a new focus as far as his DOJ is concerned and a brand new prosecution. Can you explain what the news is?
Yeah, Brian, this is shocking. The reporting is that Donald Trump has apparently found somebody to move forward on a criminal charge against former FBI Director James Comey. You know, if this actually happens, I think the weaponization of the Department of Justice will be complete. That institution will be little more than a weapon in the hand of Donald Trump. And, you know, he'll be ready to figuratively pull the trigger on absolutely baseless, evidence-free, bogus prosecutions, what we will end up referring to if this charge is actually brought as a vindictive prosecution. But if we drill down a little bit, here is what is being reported. So James Comey testified before Congress on September 30th, 2022. Why is that date important? Because there is now a suggestion by, the newly installed U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, who it looks like, at least inferentially, may be the one who's willing to bring this baseless charge against James Comey. It looks like she may be ready to pull the plug on indicting James Comey, alleging that nearly 5 years ago now, on September 30th, 2022, he lied to Congress when they were asking him something about whether he authorized a particular leak of information or not. The reason that this is coming to a head right now is because there's something called the statute of limitations. And when it comes to an allegation that somebody lied to Congress, there is a 5-year deadline on the government's ability to bring a criminal charge. So on September 30th, or perhaps October 1st, it will forever expire. And James Comey couldn't be charged with anything that he said to Congress on September 30th, 2020. I would suggest that if this actually comes to pass, there are several reasons why we're likely to see James Comey and his legal team mount the most robust and compelling vindictive prosecution defense we have ever seen in the history of our country, and that is not hyperbole.
Just a quick note for everybody watching right now. If you'd like to support our work and support independent media, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put the links to both of those channels in the post description of this video. What's the downside for the administration? Like, sure, they get all the upside of bringing the case, owning these news cycles. They get to spin it however they want, and they have a bigger megaphone than James Comey or his team are going to have. And so what is and then like way down the line, even if they lose, they've gotten all this mileage out of this stuff, and Trump gets to, ride off into the sunset like some hero. And it's not like he can suffer the consequences of a countersuit. There's no slap lawsuits that are going to happen in federal court against the administration. And so what is the downside for the Trump administration that wants the optics of fighting against his political opponents in terms of bringing these vindictive prosecutions? Does anybody shoulder any exposure on the Trump side for doing this?
Yeah, it's such an important question, because if all Donald Trump really cares about is making life miserable, if not a living hell for his enemies like James Comey, Letitia James, and others, by having his prosecutors, if he finally has found a prosecutor dirty enough and unethical enough to bring this kind of a charge, it's going to make James Comey's life, difficult. And that's an understatement. He's going to have to hire a team of lawyers. He's going to get dragged through the mud in court and perhaps in the court of public opinion. And what does Donald Trump care if they lose the case? What does Donald Trump care if judges, figuratively speaking, cram these cases down the throats of the DOJ lawyers unethical enough to bring this case in court? Donald Trump may not care, but here are the consequences, and they may not all visit Donald Trump, but some of them may. One, he's going to continue to turn federal court judges against his administration, because they are going to have to take notice that he's operating the executive branch of the federal government and the Department of Justice like a criminal organization, and it's going to make other cases that his DOJ lawyers try to bring in federal court, whether those cases are criminal or civil, all the tougher to win. Again, Donald Trump may not care. But you know what, Brian, at some point, and I know people are going to yell at me that I'm naive and I'm Pollyanna, at some point, Republicans in Congress may be forced to begin turning away from Donald Trump. Because when you have so abandoned your legitimacy as a president of the United States, you're now just, why don't you just summarily confine people, just throw them in prison with no charges and no due process at all? At some point, the Republicans in Congress are going to have to decide if they want a dictatorship, if that's the way they want American democracy to go. So every outrage, I think, has the hope of perhaps turning some Republicans against Trump. They have been speaking out against him on the Epstein matter and on some select other matters. So hopefully that snowball will continue to gain mass. And the other thing is, there are enormous consequences for any DOJ lawyer who has, anything to do with a vindictive prosecution. They will be reported to their state bar council. They will be invested for ethics violations, and they very likely will be disbarred the way so many other former Trump lawyers have been. Several have been disbarred. Others are pending disbarment. So there are lots of consequences. And I know it doesn't feel like enough, because it feels like Donald Trump should be held accountable for weaponizing the Department of Justice and throwing away any last shred of legitimacy. But Donald Trump, it looks like, has the protection of the Supreme Court. He continues to have the protection of a super majority of the Republicans in Congress. And unless and until one of those things change, we're not going to see direct consequences visit Donald Trump.
We now have two cases that have kind of grabbed the national spotlight in terms of the Eastern District of Virginia, and that is the prospect of prosecution against New York Attorney General Letitia James, and now the prospect of prosecution against former FBI Director James Comey. Whichever one happens first, what kind of a bearing is that going to have on the subsequent case, given that they're very much in the same vein? These are both vindictive prosecutions ordered by Donald Trump that have no basis in reality. And in fact, the U.S. attorney was put in place expressly so that she could bring these prosecutions. And so what bearing does the first one have on the prospect of the second?
I actually think there will be some synergy between these two cases if they both end up being brought. First of all, if we back up, Donald Trump has been yelling and screaming and posting on social media, "I want my enemies prosecuted." And he basically ousted a U.S. attorney that he put in place, I believe, the day after his second inauguration, a guy named Eric Siebert, who was the U.S. attorney that he chose to head up the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office, which would be investigating and would go on to investigate James Comey and Letitia James. And it became clear, based on the reporting and based on Donald Trump's displeasure with Eric Siebert, who he put in the job, it became clear Eric Siebert determined the evidence wasn't there. They either committed no crimes, or if there was some whiff that they did something wrong, he didn't have anywhere near proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and he declined to bring charges. That's based on all of the reporting we have seen. So Donald Trump, ousts the U.S. attorney that he appointed. He then takes somebody from the White House who has experience in insurance law and being a beauty pageant contestant multiple times, for real. Oh, and by the way, she was also put in charge of kind of scrubbing facts out of the Smithsonian museums. That was something else this new person, Lindsay Halligan, was put in charge of by Donald Trump. Takes this woman, Lindsay Halligan, and I believe not 24 hours ago, has her sworn in, installs her at the Virginia office, and expects her to indict these people when a U.S. Attorney, Eric Siebert, who had been a federal prosecutor in that office since 2010, and who the reports were that when he addressed the employees in that office, 300 strong, just days ago, when he decided he had to resign, they were in tears. Several of them were in tears because, yes, he was known as a conservative, perhaps a Republican, but he was known as an honest broker of the law and of the facts and of the Constitution. So if coming behind Eric Siebert, Lindsay Halligan, not 72 hours in the job, drops a criminal indictment on James Comey, I do not believe that's going to end well for Lindsay Halligan, for the Department of Justice, or for the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office.
In terms of this prosecution moving forward, can you talk a little bit about the rank and file? Or is this just going to be effectuated thanks to, these U.S. attorneys who were put in place? Like, what happens to the rank and file who I presume would be the folks who are normally going to work on the nuts and bolts of these prosecutions, knowing full well that what they are engaged in is a vindictive prosecution that is neither moral nor legal?
It's a great question. I suspect the majority of the rank and file will not have anything to do with an assignment that involves bringing vindictive prosecutions against Donald Trump's enemies. Now, what are the consequences of that? They may be fired, wrongfully terminated. They may self-select and leave the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office. Remember, right across the river from this U.S. Attorney's Office, which is located in Alexandria, Virginia, right across the river is the District of Columbia U.S. Attorney's Office. And Brian, they are 100 prosecutors down out of about 325 prosecutors. So ethical people are not opting to stay. There is this crazy phenomenon that's conjured up by your question. I'm so glad you asked it. We have seen now in multiple cases absolutely no rank and file prosecutors walking into court on cases like the Mayor Eric Adams, wrongful dismissal of his criminal charges. The only people who appeared in court were political appointees. Brian, that is not done. Take it from a career prosecutor at the Department of Justice. Political appointees don't go into court and do anything. They are the bureaucrats that sit in the Maine Department of Justice located between Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenue. So what I suspect we might see is either Lindsay Halligan as the U.S. attorney going into court herself. She may have a number two in the office, somebody named Maggie Cleary. If that name is very fleetingly familiar, she was the acting U.S. attorney in that very office for a cup of coffee for about 30 minutes. You may remember a few days ago, Pam Bondi said, I am appointing an acting U.S. attorney, which the Attorney General for the United States has the authority to do. She can't nominate somebody as the permanent U.S. attorney. Only the president can. But she said, I am making the acting U.S. attorney in that office. I am choosing Maggie Cleary. And then I don't think it was a couple of hours later that we saw Donald Trump saying, no, I'm nominating Lindsay Halligan. But you may have two political appointees there who are in that office. And Brian, they may be the only people that we see going to trial, and that will be a problem. Maggie Cleary was a prosecutor elsewhere, both in a county court, a local court in Virginia, and very fleetingly at the Western District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm now giving people more backstory than they might need. But as I mentioned before, Lindsay Halligan was an insurance lawyer. She has zero prosecutorial experience. And if she thinks she's going to walk into federal court and wow them with a vindictive prosecution, oh boy, she's got another thing coming.
Well, to that end, we will, of course, stay on top of this if and when these vindictive prosecutions move forward. For those who are watching, if you'd like to follow along, please subscribe to both of our channels. I'll put the links right here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work. It's completely free and a great way to show some support for independent media. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.